Hi everyone, Professor King here. In this video, I'm going to be discussing Edward Said's introduction to his larger text, Orientalism, parts 1 and 2 from the introduction, and all of that in relation to David Henry Hwang's M. Butterfly, the play. So I'll take it to a share screen in just a moment. As I'm pulling up the slideshow, I always want to remind you to pause and take notes as needed in this video. And if any questions arise, please feel free to contact me via email, Canvas messaging, Instagram, or my office Zoom hours that are on page 1 of the syllabus. All right, so let's dive right in. Edward Said, and this is from his book, his sort of seminal book on post-colonialism. He becomes sort of the granddaddy of post-colonialism. And that book is entitled Orientalism. And we'll talk about what Orientalism means in just a moment. At the end of this selection, he has this conclusion in which he says, "My two fears are distortion and inaccuracy." And I think this is so important because he's not only talking about how he is perceived by his audience, but what he's choosing and how he's choosing to write about representations of the East in Western literature and art. And we'll look at that more in a moment. But just to kind of give a brief background, if you watched the Christopher Flynn video on post-colonialism, that gives a really nice, rich, but straightforward understanding of what post-colonialism is. So I'm just going to really briefly touch on that here so that you can watch the Flynn video and get that broader sort of discussion of post-colonialism. But what it is it's a, just like the other theoretical lenses we've been looking at so far, like critical race theory or postmodernism, right? This is a different theoretical lens, and it deals with the effects of colonization on cultures and societies, particularly talking about that sort of Western colonizer, Eastern colonized, right? It's been subsequently widely used to signify the political, linguistic, and cultural experience of societies that were former European colonies or have borne the brunt of Western imperialism. And just to be a grammar colonizer myself, I'm going to add that comma here so I can feel better about myself. So there, we have, and Flynn talks about the three major figures of post-colonialism. It's funny, I was looking for a photo of these major figures, and even in the photos that describe post-colonialism, it's always this sort of Western language that we use, right? Like these people clearly are not, or at least not always from places where, let's say, for example, Catholicism or Christianity is the dominant religion, and yet we still are using these sort of Western lenses, these Western uses of language, these Western ways of framing things, and that's essentially what they're fighting, or critiquing. I shouldn't necessarily say fighting against, but critiquing, right? Is that Western mindset imposition on non-Western systems and beliefs. So we have Edward Said, Homi Bhabha, and Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak. The two on the ends here, Edward Said and Spivak, will be reading in relation to David Henry Hwang's play M. Butterfly. But Bhabha, you can read on your own. He's got some great stuff. We just, for the interest of space and time, we don't have room for him. But really, we're looking, particularly in this text, we're looking at the impact of colonization, and not just like, now, right? Not just like, the war in Afghanistan or something, but hundreds and thousands of years of colonization and how that has affected the way that non-Western cultures are represented in the West, okay? So this theory includes several different things, right? It's the study and analysis of originally and traditionally European territorial conquest. There have been post-colonial theorists that now take that idea, and because you know, the United States was originally a European colony, kind of expand that to be Western imperial interests as well. But when we're starting with Said was kind of like Gilbert and Gubar, he's a Victorianist. So he's really interested in British and English literature and British colonial literature of the mid to late 19th century, the late 1800s. So he's really looking at European effects. But in his later work, before he passed away, and I was lucky enough to see him before he passed away. I actually got to see him like 6 months before he passed away, speaking at Chapman. He talked about American imperial interest, particularly he's Palestinian, so he talked about you know, the U.S. involvement in the issues going on in Palestine, right? So we can, you know, even though we say European in a lot of these definitions, we can broadly understand that to mean the West and everything that is included in that, you know, US, Canada, Australia, Europe, England, all of those sorts of things. So that, you know, that includes the various institutions of European colonialisms. You know, like, in other words, all of the things that are involved in our culture, in our systems, in our societies, like our education, our, you know, cultural ideals, our beauty ideals, our religious beliefs, you know, become part of this colonial tradition, right? Also the discursive operations of empire. And what when we talk about discourse, right, we're talking about one of many things, but we're essentially talking about how language is utilized in the broad sense to change or affect whole entire cultures and individuals' perceptions of themselves, of reality, of the societies in which they live, and how they interact with one another. Okay. Another thing is the subtleties of subject construction in colonial discourse and the resistance of those subjects. And when we're talking about subjects in this way, we're talking about colonial subjects. Okay, we're talking about the people whose land has been colonized by Westerners. Okay, and so when we talk about the subtleties of subject construction, what we're saying there is how the West has come in and colonized and then created the narrative of what the West is and what the colonized people are, what the indigenous people are, you know, how we're defined, how we're perceived, who has the power, who is the sort of ideal and superior, who is the inferior. And so that second part, the resistance of those subjects, is really what post-colonialism deals with, right? How do we take these flawed, these false, these misleading, these outright pejorative and perjuring narratives about colonized people? How do we as colonized subjects, and I'm not speaking about myself, right? I'm speaking about people who are colonized subjects. How do we resist, right? How do we dismantle? How do we reclaim ourselves and our identity in the face of this, you know, seemingly endless, expansive Western imperialism and colonization? And so, you know, that can be in many different ways, right? That can be something like, you know, I mentioned in a previous video, like when I was younger, they had like language immersion in schools, and they basically told all students, regardless of ethnic background or country of origin, even though at the time and still currently there is no official language, right? They told all these students that they had to speak English only in the classrooms, right? And so what that in and of itself does is it privileges this Western language, right? It privileges this colonizing outlook. And it says to everything else, everyone else, particularly people who, like Indigenous students or Mexican American students, on whose land we are, you know, on whose original owned land, the land to whom these people, to whom these the people to whom this land belongs, right? We're telling them now, no, you have to speak the language of the colonizer, right? So a resistance back to that would be something like, the establishment of Spanish language only programs, or sort of Chicanx movements, or things like that, right? And we'll look at other examples in a moment. Post-colonial theory also includes the differing responses to such incursions and their contemporary colonial legacies in both pre- and post-independence nations and communities. What does that mean? Well, that's looking at the history of the resistance to colonization, right? The history of colonization itself, the history of these discourse formations, these formations of how we perceive people non-Western people from colonized groups, and then again, those resistance movements to those. And there's been fascinating work when you look at these. One that just comes immediately to mind, a former professor of mine at Cal State Long Beach, his name's Neil Holtgren. He has done some work on the Sepoy Rebellion in Asia. And he talks about how the Sepoy Rebellion was an act of resistance against colonization, and kind of what we saw there. So we see all kinds of stuff like that, right? And just in general, the impact of European imperialism upon world societies, especially now in 2020, right? Like, how has the broader sense of European imperialism, including places like America and Canada, England, Australia, all of Europe, how has that affected our entire world? Not just, the Asian continent, but Africa, North America, Latin America, all these places, right? And so now we get to Orientalism, and we have to have a little bit of background, right? In Orientalism, Said is setting up a distinction between the East, or the Orient, and the West, or the Occident, right? Which also, because again, we're always talking about power relationships, this is a distinction between the other being the East, right? Because if we think about who has power, that's the West, that's the colonizer. Who's going to be made other? Who's going to be marginalized? It's the person who is the person or group who has less power, right? So that would be the East. And Said says, this isn't a lie. This isn't a fantasy. This isn't some sort of conspiracy. It's not just in a pocket here or there, but it's infiltrated, again, really the whole world at this point. Said is writing in the 70s, but now 50 years later in 2020, we see how this Western imperialism is everywhere. It's omnipresent, right? And really the number one reason, and this goes back to Foucault too, is this idea of a material investment. The West has a material investment in the East. With Foucault, it was about sex, right? Like, the way that we can recreate labor is by recreating people, by procreating, essentially, right? The way that we, in the view of Orientalism, or I'm sorry, in the view of post-colonial theory, the way that we enhance material, enhance resources, is through colonization, is through essentially going in, colonizing, and plundering these colonized lands, right? If you think about like the Renaissance, right? Everyone talks about like how the Renaissance was this period of innovation and technological growth and all of these amazing things in Europe, right? What they forget to mention, and a post-colonial theorist would be someone who would interrogate this, is where did all that money come from to develop those technologies, or to, weave those beautiful tapestries, create that architecture, have that gold, or those spices, or all of that? Where did that come from? You can't just create technology and innovation out of nothing. It has to have material resources to do so. So where did we get those material resources for the Renaissance? Well, actually, if we think about it, right, and we think about the expansion of trade, which really was an expansion of colonialism, right, or we think about the Crusades in Africa, right, which were religious crusades on the one hand, but were also, right, ways of expanding empire. And we see that the West came into these societies, again, essentially took all their resources, pillaged their natural resources like gold and other precious minerals and foodstuffs and people, right? Using people as commodified resources. And then came back and were able to afford all of this innovation. And so that, like, we can't separate that in the same way that American capitalism is built upon the work of enslaved people. We can't separate that from the entire way that our society acts and functions and behaves, right? Because it's a part of our historical cultural identity formation. And so this material investment is really big, right? And this is something that's really big to Said. And so again, right, if you're going to go in and take all the resources out of a place, right, like let's say the oil or the gold or whatever, you're going to have to, at least in this historical model, this colonial model, assert your dominance, right, and to engage in power relationships, both at the societal level and cultural level, but also at the individual level, right? So if we look at like this, you know, this advertisement right here, this, you know, one thing, excuse me, I'm going to take a drink real quick. Maybe this is a good time to pause. One thing we see, you know, in the Asian continent, the Asian subcontinent, is these skin bleaching creams. And actually, if you do a little bit of research into skin bleaching creams, you'll know that the amount of, I believe it's lead that is allowed to be in skin bleaching creams in Asia is much higher than it is here in America. And part of the reason, and in Africa too, part of the reason for that is because they're so popular, and the way that skin lightens is by putting incredibly harmful chemicals onto the skin, right? And so if you think about the skin bleaching cream in terms of society and culture, right, you have this multi-billion-dollar beauty industry, excuse me, that is influenced by Western imperialism that says things like lighter skin is beautiful, right? The light is the ideal. You know, in places like Korea, they call the hourglass figure the S curve, right? Like, so all of these very like Western standards of beauty become imposed upon these other societies. So the colonialism starts to work both ways, right? Where it works at the individual level is somebody sees this advertisement, right? An individual woman, let's say, sees this advertisement and says, I feel so ugly because I don't fit into this Western white ideal of what beauty has been imposed upon me. And so I'm going to go spend my money now on this bleaching cream. I'm going to go get plastic surgery to have, you know, to sort of alter my eyelids, right? I'm going to do, you know, all these sorts of things to fit into this. And so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about, right? Like, not only do these global companies have a vested interest in selling to these people, right? Again, the material interest to make money and to perpetuate these very harmful ideals, Western beauty standards, right? But individuals then become, you know, play into this. So it's not just power and hegemony in terms of society and culture, but it's also the individual's identity, right? And where Said is looking, and Said doesn't talk about beauty creams, he's talking about literature. Again, he's a Victorianist, so he's talking about literature and history and where we see it in literature. In the next selection that is in the Norton anthology, he talks about Jane Austen, right? So he's concerned with that, but we see this in very contemporary ways. And what Said does say, though, is like, historically, we see this sort of empire building, right? And this colonization, this colonialism, this imperialism, we see it from the 19th century till, you know, roughly 1945. The heavy hitters, the ones who are doing most of this kind of colonizing are England and France, and even kind of prior to the 19th century, but we'll just stay there. And then from World War II onward, it's the United States, right? So let's think about that for a moment. This might be a good place to pause and think about, like, you know, if 19th century to World War II, and Said is looking at things like Victorian literature and all that stuff, what are maybe some parallels in 2020 if America is now, you know, this sort of imperializing or colonizing force? Like, what parallels do we see to maybe like literature, where this view of the East as other, as exotic, as dehumanized happens? Think about it. Take a moment to kind of go, how are we doing that to people from Eastern cultures, to people from Northern African cultures, even to people from, you know, African subcontinent and Latin American cultures? How are we othering them? How are we centering whiteness and Westernness? How are we, you know, engaging in doing that and then creating more material wealth for the West? All right, I'm going to go to the next slide. So a couple of quotes here, and just to kind of unpack them a little bit, because the part about Gramsci gets a little bit complicated unless you know who Antonio Gramsci is. So Said says, Orientalism is a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. Okay, European culture gained its strength and identity by setting itself off against the Orient as a sort of surrogate and even underground self. I think I meant to say Oriental, the Oriental, as a surrogate and underground self, right? So in other words, right, the sort of sublimation of the Oriental, right? Again, this reiteration of Western and European is the strong, is the norm, is that which we want to strive for our identity culturally and individually. And anything that is Eastern, that is Oriental, right, is surrogate, is underground, is submerged, is less than, is strange, right? And Said then says, you know, and again, Said is not saying this as if it's a good thing. He's saying we have to critique this, right? We have to interrogate this and push against this. You know, he says men make their own history. What they can know is what they have made. You know, just like maybe you didn't know that thing about the, you know, the Renaissance being funded by the pillaging of African natural resources, right, and of African people. If we know that, you know, if we don't know that, then we make history based on not knowing that, and that's dangerous. But if we know that, then we can make history, you know, for ourselves based on that knowledge and in reaction to, in resistance to those sorts of cultural behaviors. So finally, know what Gramsci's notion of hegemony is. And this is just like a little image I found online. But, you know, when Gramsci talks about cultural hegemony, he's talking about the dominant ideology of a society, right? The beliefs, explanations, perceptions, values, and morals that reflect the ruling class. Gramsci is an Italian, and he's actually writing from prison. He was in prison for his political beliefs. And so Gramsci is writing in prison, and he's saying, hey, I'm basically one of the most vulnerable people in society at this point, right? I'm an incarcerated person, and I see, right, that there is this dominant ideology of society, and if you don't fit in with that, right? If you are not part of the ruling class, speaking of the ruling class, right? If you're not part of the ruling class, then you are vulnerable in a lot of ways, right? And this dominant ideology that serves the needs of the ruling class, it justifies the social, political, and economic status quo and pretends that it is natural, that it's inevitable, that it's perpetual, that it's beneficial for everyone, rather than acknowledging that it's a social construct, that it's artificially made, that it's not real, in other words, that it's something that was invented in order to benefit the ruling class. And that is the only group in society that it serves. And unfortunately, in these Western societies, right, that ruling class, if we can look at our own society, you know, as time goes on, shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. And the people who are not part of that ruling class, who are not part of that dominant class, for whom the dominant ideology does not serve, that group expands. So more and more and more of us become what eventually, when we look at Spivak, we'll know to be called subalterns, right? At various levels, right? We have various levels of power and privilege and dominance and lack thereof. And Gramsci is talking about this within the context of, right, an imperial culture. He's Italian, right? But what happens is you have people like Edward Said, you have people like Gayatri Spivak, and they read Said's writings and they go, holy smokes, this, you know, all you have to do is replace, you know, ruling class with Western ruling class, right? And you have colonization, you know, you have the exact same thing that's going on in terms of colonization. You just take these ideas from this Italian guy who's writing this in prison, and then you apply them to how we see the way that people in colonized societies and countries are treated and portrayed by the West. And that's when they go, right? So read that a little bit more. In the second edition, it's on page 1873 or just right around there. You know, it's toward the end of this, it's in section 2, it's toward the end of this discussion, but think about what Said is saying in his application of this notion of hegemony, right? Of power. Because it's cool. Maybe you want to pause here. I mean, this is where you get to really like, whoa, and let that analysis go crazy. All right, I'm gonna have a drink and then keep analyzing, keep thinking. And I'll move on. Okay. So where do we see this in the present day, particularly in drama? And when we say drama, we're not talking about like, oh my gosh, you said drama, right? Like, oh my gosh. We're talking about dramatic arts. We're talking about theater, we're talking about film, we're talking about television, we're talking about anything that's like has a script, right? Where it's like dialogue and characters and it's supposed to be acted out. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about drama or performance, because Hwang's M. Butterfly was a play that was originally acted on the stage, and then it became a movie with Jeremy Irons and, you know, all sorts of things. But where do we see this notion of Orientalism, right? I want you to think about this quote, and then I'm going to show you a video. And I just want to warn you, there's a lot of adult language in here that, like, if there's kids running around your house, or maybe if you're at work and you shouldn't be saying these certain words, I don't know, just to kind of put your headphones on or to silence it and watch it later, because there is some of that adult language in here. But before we watch the video, I want to share this quote, and it says, it's from Said from this reading, and he says, the relationship between Occident, again meaning the West, and Orient, meaning the East, is a relationship of power, of domination, of varying degrees of a complex hegemony. Right? So think about that. Think about this idea of power relationships, domination, hegemony, as we watch this brief video, this brief clip.
Last Week Tonight asks, how is this still a thing? This week, Hollywood whitewashing. How is this still a thing? In just 1 week, we'll celebrate the Academy Awards. They promise to be controversial, as for the second year running, the nominees are whiter than a Yeti in a snowstorm, fighting Tilda Swinton. And yet some are arguing it's not entirely the Academy's fault.
Some observers say Hollywood just doesn't provide enough good roles for black actors.
One of the reasons for this might be that even when there are roles for non-white actors, they sometimes still get played by white people.
In Prince of Persia, based on a video game set in ancient Iran, Jake Gyllenhaal plays the title character.
That's right. Jake Gyllenhaal, a white American with a Swedish last name, was cast to play the Prince of Persia from, you know, Persia. And he's far from alone. Just last year, Emma Stone played the half-Asian Allison Eng in Aloha. Apparently, aloha means hello, goodbye, and you've got to be fucking kidding me. And when Hollywood needed actors to play Egyptians in Exodus, Gods and Kings, it knew just what to do.
Moses, Ramesses, you grew up together, close as brothers.
That was a guy from Australia and a guy from Britain, pretending to be two guys from Egypt, a country in Africa. And if you like that, don't miss Gods of Egypt opening Friday, starring a Scottish guy.
I shall be your one true God.
Wow, that's the whitest Egyptian since these four. All of this is nothing new. White actors have taken roles designed for every ethnicity throughout Hollywood history, from John Wayne as Genghis Khan in The Conqueror,
your treacherous head is not safe on your shoulders,
to the non-Puerto Rican Natalie Wood as Maria in West Side Story.
Buenas noches.
To the multiple instances of white actors playing Asian characters, from Marlon Brando,
Sakini by name, interpreter by profession,
to, of course, this. It's a performance the New York Times in 1961 actually praised as broadly exotic. Seriously. Yes, there's no shortage of roles for white actors playing non-white characters. The historical figure you're playing wasn't white? Not a problem. The contemporary figure you're playing wasn't white? Not a problem. The cartoon the movie was based on was entirely about non-white people? Not a problem. Your characters are named Esteban and Clara Trueba in the Isabel Allende novel the movie is based on? Right this way, Jeremy Irons and Meryl Streep. And even when a non-white person does score a major role, when they make the porn parody, guess what happens?
Don't worry, I got this.
no blame. Clear your dick away.
And when filmmakers get called out on whitewashing, the justification is less to do with black and white and more to do with greed.
Director Ridley Scott told Variety magazine he can't mount a $140 million film and say that my lead actor is Mohammed so-and-so from such and such.
Yeah, you needed the white-hot star power of whoever the fuck this guy is. And maybe all of this would be less egregious if any time an actor of color took on a traditionally white role, half the country didn't go ape shit.
The appearance of a black stormtrooper in the first trailer for Star Wars The Force Awakens is causing a lot of chatter on social media, even some racist comments.
Several people were apparently upset that the actress playing the character is African American.
He'd be the first black Bond. The author of those Bond novels saying Elba is too, quote, street.
Yes, if you're black, even if you're an actor who sometimes dresses like French Waldo, people will still say you're too street. And this isn't even getting into how movies about minorities will still put white people in the foreground. How are we supposed to believe Tom Cruise is the last samurai? This guy is the last samurai? This guy? This guy is the last samurai? This guy. This guy is the last samurai. Fuck you. So when you hear people say the Oscars are so white because the roles aren't there, just remember, the Academy gave Oscars for characters named Olan, Billy Kwan, and Luis Molina to actors named Louise, Linda, and William, all of which is enough to make you ask, Hollywood whitewashing, how is this still a thing?
All right, so I'm gonna switch to the next slide then. And this will segue thinking about Hollywood, right? And even though, you know, Broadway is not Hollywood, right? But it's kind of like, for some people, it's a step there and it's kind of a close kind of cousin, right? Let's think about M. Butterfly. you know, this play came out about 35 years ago. Like I said, on it was created for the stage by David Henry Hwang, and it's very interesting. It does a lot of things, and there's a lot going on. But the way that we're going to start this discussion is by thinking about it from a post-colonialist lens, right? We're talking about French imperialism in the character of Guillemard. We're talking about, you know, colonization, and not just in places like China, but also in Vietnam, right? Vietnam being, you know, a sort of resource stronghold for places like France and the United States around this time. And thinking about the relationship of a white man and what we understand to be an Asian woman. And I say that, you know, in finger quotes. So let's think about our understanding of post-colonialism, Said's notion of Orientalism, and let's look at this play, right? So think about certain aspects that we've seen so far in the sections we were asked to read for this week. Think about the main characters, the major players, right? Guillemard, Song Li Ling, even Helga, Guillemard's wife, Guillemard's friends, right? Think about who they are, what we know about them, how we would characterize them, what they believe about themselves. Again, if we think not just in terms of culture, but in terms of individual identity, right? What are these characters' levels of self-awareness? What do they know about themselves? What do they not know about maybe themselves and one another, right? What's their attitude, right? Again, about themselves and about others. How would we characterize them? Think about the setting. Again, we have France, we have China, right? Those are kind of the cultural settings, but then we have the prison. We have the mind, the memories of Guillemard. We have his school days. We have, you know, things going on when he's, you know, with Li Ling, Song Li Ling, right? So think about the settings, think about ideas and themes that are going on, you know, home in on where you see some of these ideas of post-colonialism coming in, but also think about gender and sexuality and the parallels those might have to colonization and imperialism in terms of things like power and domination and you know, a sort of dominant subordinate relationship. Think about militarism, espionage, concealment, right? Concealment is a word if we go back to Foucault, right? Who is concealing what about themselves and why? You know, Song might be the most obvious example, but think about other characters in the play. Think about truth and lying in a non-moral sense, right? If we're going to talk about Nietzsche, in other words, like, what is our construction of the world? What do we know about the world? And then what is reality? How does reality change if what we know changes? If the fundamental things that we think we know about reality are flipped, right? And think about some of these allusions or references, the most obvious being Puccini's play M. Butterfly. And that's in the discussion of characters like Cho-Cho-san or Pinkerton, and their sort of parallels to this play or subversions of those parallels. Think about that. Like if you've watched, I'm sorry, not M. Butterfly, Puccini's Madame Butterfly. M. Butterfly is the one we're looking at now. You know, if you've seen Madame Butterfly, or if you know anything about it, if you know anything about these characters, Cho-Cho-san or Pinkerton, right? Like, what are these characters in this play doing, again, to sort of parallel them, but also to subvert them, to resist, right? If we're thinking in a post-colonialist lens. So keep all of this character setting, ideas, themes, and illusions. Keep all of this in mind. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know I'm doing that. When we're talking about a post-colonialist lens, what are other ways you see post-colonialism at work in this text? The other, the exotic, the dehumanized other, you know, the Western rendering of the Orient as this exoticized other, and how perhaps the Orient fights back or resists against that. I'm going to take it off a share screen now. But I hope this was helpful. I hope it kind of put Said into a better context for you. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to contact me. And I know you're working on the essays from the previous unit on short stories, and so this is like a segue into this. But you know, any questions that you have, feel free to contact me. And I wish you luck on your writing, and I hope you're all doing well. All right, I'll see you all in cyberspace soon. Bye.